All right, welcome to week number 5 of the Southeast Online Bible Study on the Sermon on the Mount. We're calling it Everything is Backwards because everything we think about life is always, it seems, backwards to the ways of Jesus. And so this week we're going to be kind of talking about some of our relationships and the way that we view the world. And one of the most quoted verses of the Bible, even if people don't know the Bible, never read the Bible, is like, hey, don't judge me, only God can judge me. And I'm not sure that's what people really want. I don't think they really want the perfect judgment of God upon their bad behavior, but it strikes at the heart of how sometimes Christians and people were really judgy. And so this week we're going to dial into why that is, and then take a look at that famous thing, the golden rule, the famous saying of Jesus, and why that golden rule really is giving us the best guidance for how we're to treat others. So right now, let's dive on in. It's week 5. All right, it is week 5 of the Sermon on the Mount we're going through here. This section, everything is backwards, is what we are calling the whole study, and so everything's backwards every week. And so this one, we're talking about kind of our relationships being backwards. So we're at the very beginning, Brandon, of Matthew chapter 7 today. And so we're talking about backwards relationships. So get us going into Matthew 7.
Okay. Well, Jesus is kind of nearing the home stretch of the Sermon on the Mount here, and I think he turns his attention to how we treat one another and what that looks like. And one of the very first things he addresses in us is that tendency for us to want to judge other people. And I think there's kind of a math equation we do a little bit in our heads whenever we meet people, right? Is that we either rank them above us or we rank them below us. We think either they're worthy of honor, they're worthy of me taking care of, or they're below me, right? They, like, I'm not going to give them the time of day or whatever. I'm going to look down on them. And Jesus is coming out against that sort of mentality. It's like, no, like, don't put people on that pedestal. Don't judge, lest you be judged. And it's a very simple command. It's a very difficult command to live out, but it's also one that I think has been, misused and abused and misquoted. This seems to be the Bible verse that even people who don't read the Bible.
It comes up. So Derek, when I think about this being misused by people when they especially use that judgment statement, where do you see that going wrong, and how do you see folks misusing this passage?
I think people will use it a lot to justify their behavior. Like people, probably both inside the church and outside the church. I think you see that in like just common media and stuff like that out in the secular world, where you'll hear, only God can judge me type of thing. And it's like, well, I don't think you really want that. I don't think anybody really wants that, because the whole point
you
is,
really want God to judge your bad behavior.
The point is that Christ has completely covered us with, with his report card that we were talking, our scorecard we were talking about a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting how, just yet again, we've talked about this week after week, how, like Brandon was saying, this is this thing that judge not isn't really an outward thing. I guess it could be, but really it's an inward thing that we've all kind of been born with, right?
Yeah, we don't want that judgment of others. Sarah, where do you see this playing out just in your relationships and with others, or experiences in life?
Yeah, I was thinking too, like, we live in such a physical world where your value is on what we see. So I think we're so quick to judge people based on talents, looks, appearances. And so we automatically have a judgment. Well, really, judgment's like a byproduct of placing that value on the outward appearance, right? And so if your value is seen with your looks and appearances and everything, then that judgment is just going to happen, because that's how we place our value on people. And so I think it's really easy to do that. I know I'm guilty of it for sure. And I heard this quote where you make a snap judgment within 10 seconds if you know somebody's going to be your friend. I'm like, that's crazy. In 10 seconds. And you're basing your judgment on their appearance and their looks and not even getting to know that person. And so I think that's a huge problem in our world.
I think really this is a call to empathy. What he's actually writing on this is it's a call to empathy, because it's to understand the message behind the behavior. It's trying to understand the message behind their appearance, behind their perceptions. It's an invitation to think about why that is, because I think that is really what this is I think it's a call to do that. And I think sometimes people feel really threatened. And so they put something out, they put an image out of themselves or a perception out of themselves to protect themselves. And I think the more we chase that down, this is really a call to being empathetic to people, because judgment is really cheap.
Right.
Empathy is really hard. It's really hard to go, why are they acting this way? Why are they dressing this way? Why is this the case? Why is this whatever the environment is? Why? There's so much more to do that. So, Brandon, why is it so quick to judge? Why are we so quick to judge? And why is God not like that?
Yeah. I really kind of wonder why we are so quick to judge. It's just one of those things that I think there's something in us that makes us want to feel better about ourselves. And the easiest way to do that is to tear someone else down, right?
Okay.
We lack what we need to build ourselves up. So I'll level them.
I think that's very, very true, Sarah. Do you agree? Like, I know I can't ascend anymore, so I will descend you, and then I don't have to actually change. What else do you think? Why do we judge so quickly?
I mean, I really think a lot of it is what Brandon just said. I think it's an insecurity issue in ourselves.
Yeah.
Because again, like we want to see people, we rank people above or below us. And so it's really easy to want to be above someone else. So you just tear them down, even in your brain, which makes no sense.
Don't you judge people more harshly that are actually like you? Am I the only one? I think that's a very common thing, right?
Well,
like it's too close to home.
Yeah. I remember Brandon, we were talking about this study, and Brandon talked about the plank in your own eye and looking at the speck in your brother's. And he said a lot of times it's because the plank is so similar to what we see in somebody else.
Yeah.
And I thought that was brilliant, because I've never thought about it that way before. Like, the thing that we see in other people is usually most reflected about ourselves.
Yeah. And I think that's part of, this image that Jesus uses of the speck and the log is probably the funniest image in the Sermon on the Mount. Like, this is the laugh line in the sermon. Like, oh, that's a good joke.
Yeah.
But I think that's so true, is that oftentimes when I look at people, like, am I seeing a speck in their eye, or am I seeing the log in my own? Like, what is it that's really wrong with them? And I think so often we interpret other people's actions through our own sinful patterns.
Yeah.
Is like, I see you through the log in my eye. And so, like, they're doing that because they're selfish. Well, no, like, I'm the one who's selfish, and I'm just giving them that motivation rather than really thinking about, well, maybe that's not their story at all.
Yeah, we fill that gap of misinformation with our own problems rather than with some sort of empathetic understanding. Right. Well, Derek, what about you? Why is it so easy for you to be judgmental?
I think it goes back again. I think it's a hard issue for me, where I think at the end of the day, like, I think probably if we were all to be honest, but I'll definitely be honest for myself in this regard, is that like, the God that I tend to worship the most is me. Like, the God that I tend to worship the most is me, and anything that comes against that makes that God seem, again, myself, insignificant or uncomfortable or not enough, I tend to keep that at an arm's distance. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, there's this song by Thomas Rhett that one of our group leaders sent to me a couple weeks ago. And basically it's called, I think it's called Death Row, maybe. Basically, the concept of the song is that he and his friends, that I'm sure are other country music artists, got invited to go play music for these guys that were on death row. And the whole song is about, they expected these guys to be just monsters and so different than what they were. And as they sat there and talked with them, they had so many of the same experiences and same interests. And these guys had made significant mistakes in their life, and they're not discounting that. But they were like, we were just so surprised that these guys were just like us, but they had made these decisions. And that's what reminds me, and someone said this a long time ago, that it's like, man, like, we are all one or two bad decisions, really bad decisions away from being that person that we're so easy to judge.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that always challenges me, is that like I have to remind myself that, like, hey, like, we're all broken people. And if the person that would understand that the most would be Jesus.
Yeah, I think the reason it is for me, and I think for all of us, why we're so quick to judge, is judgment is easier than relationship.
Oh yeah.
A relationship is always harder. It's harder to get to know people we don't know,
messy.
don't trust, that have odd behaviors or odd values compared to us. And it is much harder to have a relationship, but the most efficient way to live is to be judgy. It's very, very efficient, very, very quickly rewarding, and very quickly justifying to your own actions. So Jesus kind of concludes this section with this idea of the golden rule. We all are familiar with the golden rule, which Brandon, say it in a good King James version for us.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to get the word lest in there somehow.
Sorry.
Or lest you be judged, right? But like the golden rule is that you want to treat others like you'd want to be treated. And so as we conclude the section, Jesus is giving the scorecard for how to do that. And one of the things I want to say to set this section up is it doesn't mean that you don't do hard things. I think sometimes we misinterpret this as you avoid, as a system of avoidance. No. Some of you are employers and you're going to have to fire someone. What it means is you need to fire that person in the way, if you were going to be fired, you'd want to be fired.
Exactly.
And I use that as an example because it's kind of silly. I have to correct my children. Yeah. Well, I need to correct them in a way, I need to put myself in their shoes and correct them in the way that I want. To use one that may or may not hit closer to home is I need to let my internet service provider know that there's a problem, and I need to treat that person in the call center like I'd want to be treated if I was in the call center.
Right.
Where sometimes that brings out the worstness. So as we talk about the golden rule, Derek, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
Yet again, I think the thing that God cares infinitely more about than anything else is how we treat other people. We value so many different things that we've talked about over the course of the weeks of this Bible study. The thing that he values the most is how we're treating people.
Love that.
Because ultimately, that wraps back to ourself and our relationship with God.
Yeah.
Sarah, what about you and the golden rule?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I just keep thinking back to what Derek said about the God that we like to serve so much as ourselves.
Yeah.
And so when thinking about the golden rule, like it says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We put ourselves first so many times and we honor ourselves a lot. So the way that we love ourselves and want to put ourselves first, infinitely more we should do to other people.
Yeah.
And that completely changes that rule because you are turning it from being so selfish to being incredibly selfless to someone else. And it's not just a thing to kind of back away from, but it's more to dive into of like a true relationship because you got to get close and you got to get messy because you love yourself. So why aren't you going to love somebody else infinitely more than that?
I love that line though about being our own God. It's so true.
Yeah.
I think of myself in my heart of hearts. Unfortunately, I think I'd make a great God. But time and time again, I remind myself, I'm reminded by my actions, I'm actually a really bad God.
Yeah.
And this is one of those things that allows us to get out of that mindset really well, is that if you just put people before your needs, it changes a lot. What about you, Brandon?
I appreciate what you said, Sarah, because I think that's so key to understanding the golden rule is that nobody has to tell us how to take care of ourselves, right? Like we understand that. Like we know that. And so we need to have that same sort of attitude with the people we encounter around us every day. And in fact, I remember reading once, I wish I could remember what it was in, there was a group that committed to living out the Sermon on the Mount in their relationships with one another. And one of the ways they practiced this, and I thought it was so incredibly inventive, is that they would eat lunch together every day. And as part of eating lunch together every day, you weren't allowed to get anything for yourself. So someone had to get you everything that you had. And even if it was as simple as like you wanted the salt shaker, you couldn't get it for yourself. Like someone would have to know, like, oh, Stephen probably wants pepper on his mashed potatoes or something, and give him.
Which obviously, if you knew me better, you would know I'm not a pepper guy. Come on, Brandon.
I think we should do that soon.
That's
That
great.
sounds fun.
Team lunch, guys.
Stephen
We're going to
is
try
getting
that.
pepper. But I thought that was just such a neat idea to think about. Oh, I know these people so well. I have so much empathy for them that I can anticipate what they're going to need in that moment. And I think that's a lot of what Jesus is talking about here.
That's sweet.
Brandon, I think what a great experiment. I didn't know you were going to say that, but like, can you imagine in your family, or if like we made the four of us do a lunch like that? I think it would be hilarious if we had to order for Derek, but we're trying to get it right. You know what I mean? And,
Sweet tea always.
Oh, well, we do know that. Yeah.
Half and half.
Oh, lies
Half and
lies
half.
on that. But I think that's such a rich way of realizing we are so selfish. And that is the opposite of the God we serve. And the kingdom he wants is not a selfish kingdom. It's a God that the center of the gospel is that he gave. And that is the heartbeat of what we get to live out with this golden rule, is to be a giving people that sees the other side. Bring a conclusion to this before the Sermon on the Mount, Brandon, transitions to an invitation next week.
Well, I mean, I think you hit it on the head there, is that what Jesus is commanding and commending here is nothing less than what he was willing to do. That he looked at our situation and he knew exactly what we needed. And again, it maybe wasn't exactly what we wanted. And some of these things that these people were hearing were probably like, oh, I don't know how to handle this, but it was exactly what they needed. And exactly what they needed was a savior who would come and sacrifice himself for them, for us. And I think that that's the same sort of ethic that ought to drive us as Jesus' people. We've talked from the Beatitudes on that everything in this sermon is Jesus. Like, Jesus is the Beatitudes. Jesus is the Sermon on the Mount. And we're reminded of that in the golden rule, that we have a savior who did for us what needed to be done.